Been working so hard, I'm punching my card on Segaiden episode 16.
Need to make a good impression on that important job interview?
As we'll see in time, 1985 was a huge, crucial year for Sega on the home console front, the year they really got their act together. But as we'll see here on SG-1000 this episode, there's still a little more walking to be done before the system can run, and a little more crawling to be done in some cases before it can walk. But bear with me for an episode or two. There's light to be found at the end of this tunnel. To start with, yes, it's another racing game for SG-1000. Color me surprised. Yes, GP World sees Sega tilling its favorite patch of Earth with yet another game about holding the accelerator and pressing left and right sometimes. This one does stand out from the half-dozen other racing games to have shown up on SG-1000 so far by virtue of being that most un-American of racing endeavors, Formula One. As I've noted before, Formula One racing has always fared better in Europe and Japan than in the US, for whatever reason. Over here we have IndyCar, which is almost the same thing except for some specific details that set it apart. The important thing to know is that F1 cars tend to be much faster than those found in other forms of racing, while IndyCar tends to utilize more interesting tracks, the profoundly boring Indianapolis Motor Speedway notwithstanding. To the outside observer, like me, it's more or less the same thing. You drive in a car at very high speeds around a racetrack. Cornering can be tricky, often requiring you to cut toward the inside corner, hit your brake, or simply downshift. The other major factor here, of course, is the other drivers on the course. You need to avoid them carefully, lest you brush into them lightly and cause your car, but not theirs, to instantly burst into a cloud of flame, just like in the real world, I'm sure. GP World appears to be more or less Sega's answer to pole position. It may remind you quite a bit of Super Monaco GP for Game Gear. That game plays a lot more like a sequel to GP World than it does to Monaco GP, but I suppose Sega went with that particular branding for the portable title because the world had heard of Monaco GP, whereas no one is familiar with GP World, which is kind of, but not entirely, an SG-1000 exclusive. To be strictly technical, GP World brings home an arcade game by the same title. But saying this is an adaptation strains credulity every bit as much as the suggestion that Champion Pro Wrestling adapted a Poe. Just as Champion Pro Wrestling bore little aesthetic resemblance to a Poe, what with its lack of a vertical axis, lack of real-time command functions, and lack of characters who were very blatant, unlicensed likenesses of American pro wrestlers of the era, GP World in SG-1000 looks nothing at all like the 1984 coin-op release. In arcades, GP World ran on a Laserdisc system, which allowed players to control the front end of a digital car, viewed from the virtual cockpit, over a stream of live racetrack footage. This definitely would not be the last time Sega would attempt to convert a Laserdisc experience to its home consoles, but as you might expect, such efforts didn't fare quite as well on SG-1000 as they would on, say, Sega CD. A simple 8-bit console sharing a common spec with a ColecoVision could hardly replicate the overlay and video stream format of GP World's arcade unit, and Sega didn't even try. Instead, they rebuilt a variety of racecourses in raster form and called it a day. Well, more or less. As an 8-bit Sega console racer, GP World does not hold much in the way of surprises. The biggest addition to the racing toolkit you'll find here is a simple gear shift, a la Pole Position 2. You begin each race in low gear but need to upshift once you pick up momentum, or else your top speed will be far too meager to finish a race within the time limit. There's a little nuance to shifting gears, in that you need to have hit a certain speed before upshifting and will sometimes need to downshift to maneuver through extremely tight turns. But for the most part, once you enter high gear, you just stay there without needing to think too hard about it. Beyond this one addition, GP World feels like a lot more of the same for SG-1000. Although your car doesn't look as nice here as the one in Safari Race, this game mercifully lacks that one's awful refueling mechanic. The overall moment-to-moment feel of racing is more or less the same. You go as fast as you can, slowing for turns, trying to avoid cars. As in every single other racing game on SG-1000, every car on the track makes a beeline for you as soon as you begin to move to overtake it. It's almost comical how predictable and simplistic this is. Basically, as soon as you approach another racer, you need to shift your position on the road, because they veer directly toward the point at which you triggered them. Again, hitting another car causes you to burst into flames while they scoot away unscratched, and I have to admit that this mechanic has more than worn out its welcome at this point in the console's life. Even if it's hard to feel too terribly excited about this mild variant on the console's half dozen other racers, GP World does have one interesting feature working in its favor: a track editor. No doubt inspired by the success of Lode Runner and Nuts and Milk on Famicom, Sega added the ability for players to create their own custom racetracks to GP World. This is a fairly basic editor and it lacks effective boundaries. You can very easily build a track that you can't fully resolve into a proper loop without the game ever squawking at you about how badly you're bungling it. Still, to its credit, it does offer a healthy variety of track segments, ranging from straightaways to sharp turns, and there's some fun to be had by playing through your own creations once you tire of the standard tracks. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, there's no real way to save your creations. Unlike on Famicom, the track editor doesn't appear to interface with the SR-1000, Sega's cassette recorder peripheral for the SC-3000 home computer. So you must accept the fleeting nature of your brilliance. Ephemeral like a soap bubble, your creations are all the more precious for their impermanence. Or something like that. You'll recall that the one shining light for the Othello Multivision clone console was a pretty solid port of Qbert programmed for the system by Konami. Now, Konami makes a proper debut on the SG-1000 itself with a home conversion of an arcade hit programmed by Sega. In this case, it's their arcade title, Mikey, or as it's called here, Konami no Shinnyuushain Tooru-kun. The only real difference between Mikey and Shinnyuushain Tooru-kun is where they're set. Mikey took place in a high school, whereas Totokun is a junior salaryman who sneaks around an office building, the design of which bears a curious resemblance to a high school, all the way down to the locker room. Why the change of venues? Ironically, in light of how Nintendo would throw Sega under the bus in front of Congress for supposedly promoting violence to children, the reworking of Mikey into Shinnyuushain Tooru-kun on Sega systems was a cause of the company playing it safe and trying not to court controversy in the public eye. I've touched lightly on Japan's fascination with the teen counterculture in the 80s, the Yankee and Sukeban fashions, which combined 50s greaser looks with 70s punk attitude, over on NES Works. It was a statement of rebellion against the conformity and prescribed hierarchy of Japanese society, adopted by kids who had grown up in the wake of that country's riots and protests throughout the 60s and 70s before things settled down somewhat into the rhythms and prosperity of the so-called bubble era. While nearly all of what we've seen of Japanese teen gangs in the West has been filtered through a lens of media, which has softened and romanticized the movement, my understanding is that there genuinely was a sense of danger and fear surrounding it at the time. Just as the kids in Stranger Things playing Dungeons and Dragons together in the family basement doesn't give much insight into the satanic panic that surrounded the hobby in America during the 80s, neither does playing a round of Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun really speak to the genuine anxiety that Yankee inspired among the squares. Sega cared though, and according to a Famitsu article cited in Wikipedia, Mikey seemingly encouraged the sort of teen delinquency epidemic of which Yankee were the visible extreme. Also worth noting is that around the same time that Mikey debuted, the Japanese government began to enact youth curfews that restricted the amount of time kids could spend in arcades. While this arcade lockdown has been credited by historians like Matt Alt as a crucial factor in the rise of consoles like Nintendo's Famicom and, yes, the SG-1000, you can understand Sega's caution in adapting Mikey. Here was a game found in forbidden arcades that encouraged kids to sneak out of class and fool around. Really, just asking for trouble. So instead, Mikey shed its schoolhouse setting and aged itself upward a few years to become the tale of a kid who has just entered the workforce and has zero interest in contributing to the company's bottom line. It's an interesting historic change, but ultimately it has no bearing on the gameplay. What does have a bearing on the gameplay is Sega's port job. After seeing how well Konami pulled off Qbert on SG-1000 hardware and how poorly this conversion turned out, I kinda wish Sega had left this project for the game's creators to handle themselves. Going by the title screen though, it appears Sega brought it in-house and adapted it themselves. I don't really know about Sega, but honestly, I would be loath to take credit for this conversion. It's a real chore to play, with sticky controls that undermine the game's core appeal. Mikey takes place across multiple single-screen scenarios: a classroom, a hallway, a locker room, a football field, etc., all of which have been given a light facelift to better suit their protagonist. Good luck getting beyond the initial level, though. Protagonist Totokun needs to move from desk to desk, bumping the occupant from each seat and collecting the heart next to that chair, all while steadily making his way toward the front of the office and avoiding his boss. In a pinch, you can duck into a chair for safety, or even headbutt the boss to stun him momentarily, and once you've collected everything and reached the front row, you can open the door and escape to safety. However, the actual process of doing this is really laborious, dishearteningly so. Totokun has a lot of trouble lining up with other office workers and chairs, and attacking the boss is an unreliable tactic at best. You'll sometimes pass over active hearts without collecting them, and even once you prime the room for your escape, simply making your way out the door is a hit-or-miss prospect. I was tempted to explain my control woes away as a product of the SG-1000's controller's habit of disintegrating over time, but that's not really the issue. Even after attempting to play this cartridge on a few different pieces of hardware, with several different controllers, including an 8-bit do-pad, Totokun still feels awful. It's not unplayable, but it definitely feels a lot less fun than it ought to be. At least this cartridge retains one essential element of the arcade version. It's the only SG-1000 release to include licensed Beatles music. Yes, for whatever reason, Konami decided that its game about a skirt-chasing high school delinquent should include an 8-bit rendition of A Hard Day's Night, and that appears here as well, in all the one-channel musical glory Sega could muster. I've read that Sega got in a bit of hot water for adding tracks like Popcorn and YMO's Rydeen to its early arcade video games without permission, so I can imagine that the idea of paying Apple Records for the privilege of including a Beatles jam in this game must have been quite a revelation. And just think, this was the first domino that set up Paul and Ringo's career highlight of stumping for Rock Band at E3. Coming immediately on the heels of Mikey, we have Konami's second and final arcade conversion of sorts for the SG-1000, Hypersports. This belongs to the track and field family of games, although this is not track and field as you NES faithful may know it. This would be it for Konami and SG-1000, and honestly, Hypersports and Totokun aren't the best showing. Considering how much love the publisher invested into Famicom and MSX development, I'd kinda take it personally if I were Sega. Anyway, Hypersports. This is, in essence, the sequel to Konami's arcade smash Hyper Olympic, better known as Track and Field. In arcades, Hypersports played a lot like Track and Field, featuring more than half a dozen events that amount to wanton button mashing, or in the case of archery and skeet shooting, precisely timed button tapping. This is not that game. In fact, it feels like a show of bad faith for Sega to call this cartridge Hypersports, because it has almost nothing in common with the arcade machine by the same name. You'll find a paltry 4 events here, only 2 of which appeared in the Hypersports coin-op. The event mix here, which is diving, long horse trampoline, and horizontal bar, creates the distinct impression that this is meant to be a direct take on Epyx's Summer Games. And it's about as fun, which is to say, not at all, here in the year 2021. Not unlike Totokun, Hypersports has extremely fiddly controls, to the point that I can't actually seem to earn a passing score on the very first event, diving, no matter what approach I take. Looking at online videos of the game, the other events fall very much in line with diving. There's none of the mindless, frenzied, finger-blistering button mashing that people associate with track and field to be found here. Hypersports is all about incredibly brief events that expect players to line up their virtual athlete perfectly according to some invisible, unspoken standard. Given the paltry number of events here and how brief and joyless they can be, Hypersports is a real dud. I don't know if you can blame Sega for this one, though. While this game was programmed by them, the adaptation is based on Konami's own MSX conversion of the coin-op. From what I can tell, these are the only 2 versions of Hypersports to offer this exact content lineup. On other platforms, including Famicom, Hypersports works a lot more like it did in arcades. Given how closely this hews to summer games, the only explanation I can offer was that Konami looked at Epyx's computer hit and figured that's what the computer audience wanted. Or maybe not. Whatever the case, SC-3000 and SG-1000 fans definitely got the short end of the stick when it came to Konami's 8-bit legacy. And finally this episode, a game that will definitely be familiar to NES fans, Tecmo's Star Force. This is one of a handful of arcade conversions that existed in more or less an unaltered state on both the NES and SG-1000, which allows us to compare the two directly. This is almost the same Star Force that appeared on NES, one of those rare games to appear in almost identical form on the two systems. The NES version of Star Force, of course, was a huge hit in Japan. It cemented publisher Hudson's legacy as a blockbuster star of the Famicom and spiraled into its own legacy, giving rise to the iconic Takahashi Meijin and his 16-shot finger speed, along with the derivative Samizdat Star Soldier franchise that survived into the Nintendo 64 era. Star Force was a big deal for Nintendo fans. The SG-1000 port doesn't have the same legacy, but it appears to have fared reasonably well all the same. One of the final cartridge-based releases for the console, it would be one of the 5 SG-1000 carts reissued on the compact MyCard format later in 1985, suggesting it managed to be popular enough to at least warrant keeping in circulation. And understandably so. Star Force on SG-1000 maintains pretty decent parity with the NES release, despite running on hardware with inferior graphical capabilities and a lack of support for hardware scrolling, which is so essential to this shooter's design. The console's choppy scrolling does work to Star Force's detriment, though it certainly doesn't render this version unplayable. The vertical scrolling here advances more slowly than in Starjacker, but more quickly than in Space Armor, so you'll notice a moderate rather than severe amount of chop. Star Force doesn't really stand out as remarkable in the present day, but if you put yourself in the proper mindset, that is, the mindset of, it's 1985 and I just bought a new console with several months' allowance, the game's appeal isn't too difficult to grasp. I keep referring to Xevious as the touchstone for the shooter genre of this era, and when you look to Star Force through that lens, it becomes more impressive. Namco's shooter was a hit in Japanese arcades, and the home conversion was a bestseller as well. It exerted a heavy influence on many other shooters, and of those descendants, Star Force offered the richest play experience. This is a fast-paced, unrelenting shoot-'em-up. Enemies streak onto the screen from all directions in large formations at high speeds, peppering players with projectiles and demanding they keep their eyes wide open. You can blow up both enemy spacecraft and ground emplacements, though unlike in Xevious, you don't need to fuss with alternating fire between air-to-air and ground-to-ground. Simply shoot and evade. Your attacks will also reveal score bonus icons, and on occasion, power-ups that add strength to your ship. Maintaining the eye-watering pace of the action, boss enemies appear at the end of each stage and you have about 5 seconds to destroy them before they escape. This is very much a game about racking up points, rather than simply seeing how far into the game you can advance. And between the speed of the action and the intricacy of the scoring mechanics, on that front it has a lot to offer. Again, by modern day standards, shooters like this feel downright old-fashioned compared to dizzying bullet hell maniac shooters. But we wouldn't have gotten to the works of Rising and Cave without Star Force to amp up the speed and intensity of the genre in the first place. This is a strong port of an arcade classic to SG-1000, slick enough that even the shooter pros at Compile would have been proud to put it on their resumes. Sure, the NES version is more accessible, more affordable, and more visually refined, but as Sega geared up for the launch of the advanced Mark III upgrade, Star Force was a pleasant demonstration that the SG-1000 still had plenty to offer. Next time on Segaiden, change is definitely in the air for SG-1000.